The monitor flatlined at 6:47 a.m., and every doctor in that emergency room took one step back. Every doctor, except her. Nurse Dara Voss moved before the attending even processed what was happening, hands already on the patient's chest, airway already assessed, jaw already set, like she'd done this in a ditch. Somewhere in a country most people couldn't find on a map. She had. Nobody in that hospital knew that yet. What they did know was that she was a nurse. A nurse. And when the patient's heart restarted under her hands, the attending didn't thank her. He reported her. By 8 o'clock, Dara Voss had been suspended, humiliated in front of her entire unit, and ordered to clear her locker by noon. By 9:15, 31 wounded soldiers were bleeding through the ER doors, and every doctor in the building was looking for the woman they'd just thrown out. If you're watching this right now, do me one favor. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to witness is the kind that only gets more intense from here. And when you're done, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The thing about Dara Voss that nobody at Hargrove Military Medical Center ever bothered to understand was that she was not a person who needed to be liked. She had spent 3 years in places where being liked was irrelevant, where the only metric that mattered was whether the person in front of you was still breathing when the dust settled. She had learned to work in mud, in darkness, with equipment that was failing and supplies that were running out, alongside people who were terrified. And she had learned deeply in the way that only repetition under pressure teaches that hesitation was the thing that killed people. Not the enemy, not the injury. Hesitation. She brought all of that into the ER every single morning. And every single morning, it made the wrong people uncomfortable. Hargrove sat on the edge of Creston Harbor, Virginia, a city that existed largely because of the naval installations that surrounded it on 3 sides. The hospital was technically civilian staffed, but operated under a military oversight structure that made it, in practice, a hybrid, the kind of institution where the chain of command mattered more than outcomes, and where the politics between departments could get a person fired faster than an actual medical error. Dara had been there for 2 years. She knew the layout, knew the policies, knew which attending physicians were solid under pressure and which ones performed better during the quiet parts of the shift when nothing real was happening. She knew who would back her and who wouldn't. She'd learned most of that the hard way. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with dark hair she kept pulled back so tight it looked almost severe, and the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for arrogance. It wasn't arrogance. It was the result of having spent years in environments where small movements could matter, where you trained yourself out of the habit of unnecessary motion. She didn't fidget. She didn't fill silence with noise. When she assessed a patient, her eyes moved quickly and precisely, the way a person's eyes move when they've been trained to catalog a scene rather than simply observe it. She had been a combat Medic 68W, attached to a forward surgical team deployed twice in conflict zones before a lateral injury to her right knee during a vehicle rollover ended that chapter of her life. The military had offered her options. She'd taken her separation pay, finished her nursing credentials at a state university on the accelerated track, and ended up at Hargrove because it was close enough to the base that her skills felt relevant and far enough from her old unit that she could stop looking over her shoulder for people she used to know. She didn't talk about her background at work, not because she was ashamed of it, because it didn't seem to matter to anyone, and she'd learned early that the staff at Hargrove processed her differently when they knew treating her either like a curiosity or like a threat to the natural hierarchy, neither of which was useful during a 12-hour shift. So she let them assume she was a career civilian nurse who was very good at her job, and she focused on the patients. That morning, a cold Tuesday in early February, The sky over Creston Harbor, the specific gray of old concrete. She arrived at 6:15 for the start of her shift and found Trauma Bay 2 in the middle of a situation that had clearly been developing for several minutes before she walked through the door. The patient was a retired Marine, 61 years old, brought in by ambulance following a cardiac event at the VA satellite clinic across the harbor. He was on the table, the team was around him, and the attending on-duty doctor. Leonard Ferris, a 53-year-old an internal medicine physician who had been reassigned to trauma coverage that fed to a staffings that had been ongoing for 6 weeks, was ordering a medication protocol that Dara recognized immediately as wrong. Not slightly off. Wrong. The patient's presentation, his rhythm on the monitor, the specific pattern of his symptoms, everything pointed to a ventricular arrhythmia with a secondary component that the medication Ferris had ordered would make significantly worse. She said so. Not loudly, not dramatically. She stepped to the counter, checked the chart, checked the rhythm strip, and said, "Doctor Ferris, this pattern looks like torsades. The amiodarone is going to drop his QT further." Ferris looked at her the way men look at people they've already decided not to hear. "I didn't ask for your input, Voss. I know. I'm giving it anyway. He's going into VFib. He's not. Look at the rhythm. It's polymorphic. The amiodarone's contraindicated here. He needs magnesium sulfate and the underlying electrolyte issue addressed." She kept her voice even. Factual, the same tone she would have used, giving a radio report from a forward position. The nurses in the bay went quiet. A respiratory tech near the ventilator found something extremely interesting to examine on the ceiling. Ferris turned to the charge nurse. "Get me 200 of amiodarone." Dara moved to the medication cart. "I'm not going to draw that up." The room went very still. "I beg your pardon? You can report me. But I'm not drawing up a medication that's going to kill this patient when the correct treatment is sitting right there." She nodded toward the magnesium sulfate on the shelf. "I'll draw up the mag. I'll document every word of this conversation. But I'm not giving him something that's going to cause a fatal event." What followed was the longest 8 seconds of the morning. Ferris stared at her. The monitor continued its irregular complaint. The retired Marine, barely conscious, had no idea that the woman at the medication cart was the only person in the room who was going to keep him alive. Then the rhythm shifted a run of polymorphic beats, exactly the pattern Dara had named, and Ferris, to his credit, looked at the strip again. His expression changed. He didn't say anything. He just said, "Give the mag," and then he walked to the far side of the bay and picked up a chart and stared at it for a while, and nobody said anything about it. The patient's rhythm stabilized within 4 minutes of the magnesium infusion. Dara documented everything with the precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that the written record was the only thing that survived intact after everything else fell apart. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. At 8 o'clock, Nursing Director Sylvia Holt summoned her to the administrative corridor on the 3rd floor. Dara had been in Holt's office exactly twice in 2 years, once for her initial orientation, once for a mandatory compliance review. The office was aggressively beige, decorated with the kind of motivational plaques that existed to fill wall space rather than motivate anyone. And Holt herself was a 58-year-old administrator who had not worked a clinical shift in more than a decade. She had the posture of a person accustomed to delivering unpleasant news and the tone of someone who had rehearsed this particular conversation. Standing beside Holt's desk was Dr. Elliot Marsh. Marsh was the chief of medical staff. 47, with a particular brand of institutional confidence that came from having been the most important person in every room he'd occupied for the last 15 years. He didn't like Dara. He'd made that clear from the first time she'd challenged a resident's dosing decision in front of 3 other physicians. He had the ability to make things difficult for people at Hargrove, and he used that ability with the casual frequency of someone who'd never been told no. "Sit down, Dara," Holt said. "I'd rather stand." A small pause. Fine. Holt opened a folder. We're here because of the incident in Trauma Bay 2 this morning. I'm aware. Dr. Ferris filed a formal complaint. He states that you refused a direct medical order, disrupted patient care, and interfered with his treatment protocol in a manner that was insubordinate and potentially dangerous. Dara said nothing. She was looking at a point on the wall just past Holt's left shoulder, her hands loose at her sides. Do you have anything to say in response? The patient's chart will show the outcome. The rhythm strip will show what his presentation was. The nursing note I filed at 6:48 will show exactly what I said and what I did and why. If Dr. Ferris wants to file a complaint, he's welcome to. The documentation will speak for itself. Marsh finally spoke. He had the voice of a man who had spent decades being agreed with. That's not the point, Voss. The point is that you don't get to override attending physician decisions based on your personal assessment. You're a nurse. Your role is to execute the care plan, not design it. My role is to the patient. Your role, Marsh said, is defined by this institution's. The patient would have coded within 8 minutes on amiodarone. He's stable now. If that's a problem for this institution, then we have a larger conversation to have. Marsh looked at Holt. Holt closed the folder. Dara, she said. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full review. We're asking you to surrender your access badge and clear your personal items from your locker. The review panel will convene within the week, and you'll be notified of the outcome. Dara looked at her for a moment. You're suspending me for saving his life. We're suspending you for insubordination. Right. She turned toward the door. I'll get my things. She didn't slam the door on the way out. She didn't need to. The locker room on the second floor was empty at 8:15, which was either lucky or exactly what she'd expected. Dara moved through it without ceremony, pulling her extra pair of scrubs from the top shelf, taking down the small photograph she'd kept tucked in the corner, a faded image of her old unit taken somewhere outside Kandahar, the faces blurred by time and by the specific mercy of bad lighting. She'd kept it there for 2 years without anyone ever asking about it. She wrapped it in the scrubs and put it in her bag. She wasn't angry. She recognized the feeling she was having, and it wasn't anger. It was something older and more tired, the particular exhaustion that came from being in a place where the rules existed to protect the institution rather than the people inside it, and where the cost of doing the right thing was always paid by the person who did it. She'd felt it before. In the Army, near the end, when she'd started to see the distance between what the mission was supposed to be and what it actually was. She knew how that story ended. You carried it, or it carried you. She closed the locker and stood there for a moment, one hand on the metal door, and let herself have exactly one breath of something that felt almost like grief. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the elevator. She was going to get in her car. She was going to drive to the harbor and sit somewhere and figure out what came next. There were other hospitals. There were travel nursing contracts that paid well and required nothing of her emotionally and would let her do her job without the political infrastructure. She was good enough that she could work anywhere. She knew that. She'd always known that. The elevator opened on the ground floor. She stepped out, crossed toward the main exit, and was 7 steps from the sliding glass doors when the ground shook. Not metaphorically. The floor physically shook a rolling vibration that moved up through her boots and into her knees, followed 2 seconds later by a concussive wave of sound that she felt in her sternum before she heard it. The overhead lights flickered. A glass vase on the reception desk fell and shattered. Somewhere above her, an alarm began to sound. Dara stopped walking. She turned toward the windows. Outside, in the direction of the naval installation that sat 3 miles east of Hargrove, across the water, a column of black smoke was rising against the gray sky. Thick and fast, and already too tall, the kind of column that only came from something large burning intensely. Secondary flares of orange light pulsed at its base, which meant it wasn't done yet. Whatever had happened, it was still happening. She stood there for 4 seconds. Her bag was in her hand. Her badge was gone. She was technically not an employee of this hospital as of approximately 40 minutes ago. She watched the smoke column climb. Then she heard the sirens. Not one, not two. Multiple sirens, moving fast, moving toward Hargrove, and she recognized the specific pitch of military transport vehicles without consciously deciding to catalog the sound. Her brain just did it automatically, the way it had been trained. The sliding glass doors burst open. A security officer ran through them, radio screaming in his hand, talking fast to someone on the other end. Mass casualty activation. Multiple incoming military personnel. ETA under 4 minutes. We need full trauma team response. The lobby erupted. Overhead, the PA system crackled to life. Code Bravo. Code Bravo. All trauma personnel report to emergency stations immediately. Mass casualty event. Multiple critical inbound. Code Bravo. Dara looked at the doors. She looked at her bag. She put the bag down behind the reception desk, against the wall, where it would be out of the way. She was not going to analyze this decision, or defend it, or explain it to anyone. She turned and walked back toward the ER, and the part of her that had been trained to function under pressure slid quietly into place, like a key in a lock that had been waiting for it. The ER was already in controlled chaos. By the time she pushed through, the double doors controlled, because the nurses had started moving immediately, not because anyone was actually in control. She did a fast assessment without stopping. 4 trauma bays prepped, 2 attending physicians on the floor, one of whom was Ferris, whose face was the specific color of someone who wished he was somewhere else. 3 residents who looked frightened, a handful of nurses who looked frightened, but were managing it better. 3 ER techs moving supplies, with the efficiency of people who knew what Code Bravo meant. The charge nurse was a woman named Brigitte Solano, 20 years in this ER, built like someone who had never had the option of fragility. She saw Dara come through the doors, and her expression moved through surprise, relief, and a complete absence of interest in asking questions in that order. "You're suspended," Brigitte said. "I know. You know I have to report that you came back." "I know." A beat. Brigitte handed her a set of gloves. "Oneg's already running to the cooler. We've got limited on the B positive, so triage has to be tight." "How many incoming?" Initial report said 15. "Radio's been updating. Could be more. Do we have a nature of injury?" "Explosion. Naval Base Training Facility. Details are still coming in." Brigitte was already moving. "Start setting up Bay 1 for blast trauma. We're going to need chest seals and decompression needles up front." Dara was already moving. She pulled a supply cart toward Bay 1 and started laying out what she needed with the methodical speed of someone who had done this in less ideal conditions than a stocked emergency room blast trauma protocol meant. She was thinking about primary injury from the pressure wave, secondary from fragmentation, tertiary from being thrown by the force, and quaternary from the fire and toxic exposure that came after. She was mentally sorting priorities before the first truck arrived, the way she'd been taught to, the way that 2 combat deployments had embedded into the operating system of her thinking so deeply. It no longer required conscious effort. Ferris appeared at her shoulder. "You're supposed to be. If you want to tell me to leave," she said, without looking up, "you'll have to wait until the patients are stable. After that, I'll go wherever you want." He didn't say anything. She heard him move to Bay 3. The first military transport rolled into the ambulance bay at 9:17. The doors flew open. The first casualty they brought in was a young man, she estimated mid-20s, with blast injuries to his lower extremities and a penetrating fragment in his left shoulder. He was conscious and trying to sit up, which was both a good sign and a problem, because the fragment needed to stay in place until they could assess what it had hit. She got to him before the transport team had finished explaining his vitals. already talking to him in the low, steady voice she'd used in the field, telling him to stay still. Telling him the fragment was staying where it was for now, and that was a good thing. "Where's your pain?" she said. "Everywhere," he said. "I need you to scale it. 8, 9 on the legs." "Okay. What's your name?" "Specialist Ortega. Aaron Ortega." "I'm Dara. Aaron, look at me. Are you having any trouble breathing?" "No." "Any pain in your chest?" "No. Just my legs and the shoulder thing." "Good. That's good. I need you to stay flat, and I need you to trust me on that." He looked at her. He was pale and clearly scared and doing a reasonable job of not showing it. "Are you the doctor?" "I'm better than that," she said, and the absolute flatness of her delivery made him blink and then almost laugh, which was exactly the response she'd wanted, because it gave her a second to assess his respiratory rate while his attention was briefly elsewhere. 14 breaths per minute. Good. She called the fragment status to Ferris, who actually listened this time. The second casualty came through while she was still working the first, then the third. Then 4 and 5 arrived simultaneously, and the ER began to sound like she remembered it, sounding in a different context, in a different country, on days that had never fully left her memory, the specific acoustic signature of a trauma environment running at capacity, where the noise was not panic, but pressure, constant and accumulating. She worked. She moved between bays with the efficiency of a person who had stopped thinking about individual tasks and was simply executing, assessing, calling, adjusting, communicating between the nurses and the physicians in clear, direct language that left no room for ambiguity. She found a tension pneumothorax on casualty 6 that would have been missed for another 2 minutes if she hadn't been listening to his breath sounds, while the resident was focused on a bleeding scalp wound. She decompressed it with a 14-gauge needle and said, "Get a chest tube tray." And the resident looked at her like she'd done something supernatural, which was not supernaturalism. It was basic chest pathology and a stethoscope. By the time the 8th casualty came through the doors, the ER had found its rhythm. Not perfect. Nothing like this was ever perfect, but functioning, which was the only thing that mattered. Then the 9th casualty came in, and the rhythm broke. He arrived on a stretcher with 2 military escorts who were not letting anyone near him, which was immediately a problem, because he needed people near him. He was in his early 50s, broad through the chest, wearing what remained of a tactical vest that had clearly absorbed a significant portion of a blast. His blood pressure on arrival was 84/62. His breathing was labored, his abdomen was rigid in a way that meant internal bleeding, and embedded in his left flank, angled up and inward at approximately 30 degrees, was a 12-inch piece of structural steel rod. "Nobody pulls that rod," Dara said, before anyone else said anything. Ferris was already reaching for it. She caught his wrist. "Not hard, just enough to stop the motion. Get your hand off me, Voss. If you pull that rod, the object displacement releases the tamponade. He bleeds out in under 90 seconds. She was looking at the angle, at the entry point, at the way the patient's pressure was maintaining poorly, but maintaining, which meant the rod was doing what it had inadvertently done, which was functioning as a plug. This is a controlled extraction. He needs an OR and vascular on standby before anyone touches it." Ferris stared at her. She could see him working through it. She could see the moment he arrived at the same conclusion, because his hand moved back. "Who is he?" Brigitte said quietly, beside Dara's shoulder. "No ID visible," one of the military escorts said. He was a young man in Navy utilities who was doing an excellent job of maintaining a professional exterior over what was clearly significant distress. "Ma'am, he stopped. He's important. They're all important," Dara said. "Get me a blood pressure cuff that works. Get me a second large bore IV access on his right arm, and someone page vascular right now." "Vascular surgeon is 20 minutes out," a nurse called. "Then we maintain and we wait," Dara said. Nobody moves that rod. She held pressure on a secondary wound at his shoulder, watching his vitals cycle on the monitor above the bay. Doing the math she'd been doing for years, the calculation of how long a person could sustain this before the window closed. His pressure dropped to 78. She increased the drip rate. It held. Somewhere behind her, through the ER doors, she heard the lobby doors open, with the particular controlled violence of people moving through them, quickly and with purpose. She heard boots on the linoleum, not civilian footwear. Military. She did not turn around. Her hands stayed where they were. "Pressure's holding at 81, the nurse beside her said. "Keep calling it every 90 seconds. The boots stopped at the entrance to the trauma bay. A voice said, "Which one of you is Dara Voss?" The voice was the kind that had spent decades being obeyed. She knew the register of it without turning around the particular combination of authority and economy that came from a certain kind of command experience where you learned very early that volume was for people who hadn't yet figured out that calm was more effective. Ferris, standing 3 feet behind her, pointed. Dara said, "I'm a little busy right now." A pause. "I can wait," the voice said. She heard him move to the side of the bay, out of the way, with the practiced situational awareness of someone who knew how to occupy a space without disrupting it. She focused on the man with the steel rod in his side, whose blood pressure was holding at 81. It was still alive, who was going to stay that way. For now. The vascular surgeon arrived in 19 minutes and 40 seconds, which Dara knew because she'd been counting. His name was Dr. Priya Anand, and she came through the ER doors, still pulling on her second glove, hair tied back, eyes already moving to the monitor above the bay with the specific focus of someone who had been briefed in transit and was already at 3 steps ahead of the room. She was maybe 40 compact, with the efficient movements of a person who did not waste motion, and when she got to the bedside and assessed the rod angle and the pressure readings, her expression didn't change, which Dara read as a good sign. "How long has he been holding at this pressure?" Anand said. 22 minutes. He dropped to 78 briefly, came back up to 81 with the drip adjustment. "Blood type? O negative until we get a cross-match back. Lab's running it now." Anand leaned over the patient and examined the rod's entry angle without touching it, her face close enough that Dara could see her eyes moving in small, precise arcs. The patient was conscious barely, intermittently, and when he was quiet in the way that people in serious pain went quiet, all their energy redirected away from speech and toward the basic project of continuing to exist. "We need to move him," Anand said. "OR 3 is being prepped. Should be ready in 6 minutes. Brigitte called from the nurse's station. Make it 4. Anand straightened and looked at Dara directly for the first time. "You held the rod." "Yes." "Good call." She said it the way a surgeon said things plainly, without embellishment, and already moving on to the next problem. "You're coming with me. I want you scrubbed in." From somewhere behind her, Dara heard Ferris start to object, and then she heard nothing more from Ferris, which meant either Anand had silenced him with a look, or he'd thought better of it on his own. She didn't turn to check. She was already moving with the gurney as they rolled the patient toward the ORR corridor. The man with the rod in his side was stable enough to transport. His name they still didn't know. His face, beneath the blast residue and the pallor of blood loss, had the weathered quality of someone who had spent significant time outdoors in difficult conditions, not aged exactly, but marked. There was a scar along his left jawline, thin and old. His hands, even slack with injury, were the hands of a person accustomed to physical demands. Zas noticed these things the way she noticed everything, cataloging without meaning to, building the picture of a person from the evidence available. Behind them, in the ER they just left, the work continued. The OR was cold in the specific way that operating rooms were always cold, and under the lights, everything went flat and bright and procedural. Dara scrubbed in beside the circulating nurse and took her place at the instrument table, while Anand positioned herself over the patient and the anesthesiologist, a quiet man named Doctor. Ren, who looked like he'd been doing this since before Dara was born, worked through his induction sequence with the unhurried precision of someone who had made his peace with high situations a long time ago. She'd been in operating rooms before, not as a nurse, not originally as a medic, working alongside forward surgical teams in austere conditions that looked nothing like this and demanded the same skills. She understood the rhythm of it. She understood that her job right now was to anticipate, to be ready with the right instrument before Anand asked, to watch the field and the monitors simultaneously, and to say something if she saw something that mattered. The extraction took 47 minutes. It was not clean. It was not the kind of surgery that looked the way surgeries looked in films, quiet and confident, and resolved by a single decisive moment. It was incremental and pressured, and twice required decisions that Anand made in real time with incomplete information, which was what surgery often actually was. When the rod finally came free-controlled, irrigated, with vascular clamps already in position, the blood loss was significant but manageable, and the damage to the structures adjacent to the entry point was less than it could have been. When Anand stepped back from the field, she exhaled once, long and controlled. "He's going to have a difficult 48 hours, she said. "But he'll have them." Dara stripped her gloves and helped transfer the patient to recovery. Standing in the scrub corridor afterward, she realized her hands were shaking very slightly. Not from fear, from the adrenaline leaving her system, the body's delayed accounting for what she'd been running on for the last 90 minutes. She pressed her palms flat against the wall and let it pass. It always passed. When she pushed back through the doors into the main corridor, the man with the command voice was waiting. He was standing against the opposite wall, not leaning standing. The distinction being that leaning implied some degree of ease, and this man did not appear to have any relationship to ease. He was in his early 60s, tall, with the kind of physical presence that had less to do with size than with the way he occupied space, like the space around him was aware of him. He wore a Navy uniform with a specific arrangement of insignia that Dara's brain processed and filed before she consciously decided to look. Rear Admiral, or higher. She needed a better angle on the shoulder boards. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, not hostile, not performatively neutral. Something more like evaluation. Evaluation, the way a person looked at something they were still making up their mind about. "Voss," he said. "Still a little busy," she said, and kept walking. He fell into step beside her, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected him to plant himself in her path and demand a conversation. Instead, he matched her pace, and for 4 or 5 steps, they simply walked together down the corridor, which was an unusual opening. "How is he?" the Admiral said. "Stable. Critical but stable. He has a challenging couple of days ahead of him." She glanced sideways. "You know him." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Who is he?" "That's a conversation for a different setting." He said it without apology. "Right now I need to understand what happened out there." "In the ER." "Yes." She pushed through the stairwell door and took the stairs, not the elevator, because she needed to move, and the elevator was slower. He followed without comment. "What specifically do you want to know?" she said. "Walk me through it. From the first arrival. I filed a nursing incident report. It'll be more accurate than anything I tell you from memory right now." "I don't want the report," he said. "I want to know what you saw." She looked at him again as they descended the stairs. The shoulder boards confirmed it. "Vice Admiral. Whatever this was, it was not a routine debrief. I saw a mass-casualty event that the ER was not fully prepared for," she said. "Not because they're bad physicians, because nothing prepares you for multiple, simultaneous blast trauma presentations, except having done it before." She paused at the landing. "Some of the staff here hadn't done it before. But you had." She started down the next flight. That's a separate conversation. Voss. I know what you're doing, she said, and I understand why. But I'm still technically suspended from this hospital, and I spent the last 2 hours doing work that I was explicitly told I was no longer authorized to do, and I'd prefer to let the immediate situation resolve itself before we start talking about my background. He was quiet for 2 steps. Fair enough, he said. For now. They came out on the ground floor, and she turned toward the ER, because regardless of this employment status, and regardless of this conversation, there were still patients in that department who might need what she had. The ER, when she pushed back through the doors, had shifted from acute chaos to the sustained and grinding labor of its aftermath. The initial surge of casualties had been received, triaged, and distributed 4 patients upstairs in CU beds, 3 in surgery or post-op, 6 in monitored bays below, 2 who had been stabilized and transferred to the military hospital on the base proper. The worst of the arrivals were accounted for. What remained was the sustained work of keeping people stable, of monitoring the ones whose conditions hadn't fully declared themselves yet, of managing pain and fluid balance, and the dozen smaller crises that were always happening at once in a busy trauma environment. Dara moved through it without asking anyone's permission. Nobody stopped her. Brigitte, passing with a medication tray, said nothing, except Bay 6 needs a reassessment on his chest tube output. And Dara said, on it, and that was the entirety of that conversation, which was the only kind of conversation either of them had time for. She found the patient in Bay 6, a young Navy explosive ordnance technician named Kepner, 26 years old, with a chest tube that had been placed during the initial trauma response and was now putting out a volume that was slightly elevated from where she wanted it. She reassessed his breath sounds, checked the tube position, examined the drainage characteristics, and determined that the output was within an acceptable range for his presentation, but needed to be logged and watched. She documented it. She left a flag note for the physician to reassess within the hour. Then she went to Bay 8, where an older casualty, a chief petty officer, who'd been at the facility during the explosion and had sustained a moderate TBI in addition to his blast injuries, was agitated and had pulled out one of his peripheral IVs. She talked him through reestablishing the line, keeping her voice at the specific pitch and cadence that she had learned years ago worked better than restraints for most confusion presentations. That the brain in its disoriented state responded to calm, not because calm was reassuring in any psychological sense, but because it was a different frequency from the noise of its own distress. The chief petty officer looked at her at one point and said, "You were Army." She paused in what she was doing. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk to me." He blinked. His eyes were not fully tracking. "My daughter was Army. Is she deployed?" "Germany." "She's in Germany." He seemed to find this satisfying in some basic way. "Germany's okay." "Germany's fine," Dara agreed, and continued securing the IV line. She was taping down the dressing when she heard raised voices from the direction of the nursing station. Not patient distress, administrative distress, which had a different pitch, sharper and more specifically human in its unpleasantness. She finished the tape, checked the flow, and walked toward the station. Sylvia Holt was there. Holt had come down from the 3rd floor in her administrative capacity, and she was standing at the nursing station with the tight expression of a person who had been humiliated by circumstances and was looking for somewhere to redirect that feeling. Standing opposite her, with his back to Dara, was the Vice Admiral, and 2 of his staff, a younger officer and a woman in a dark suit, who had the specific quality of a person who was taking note of everything without appearing to. "This is a civilian medical facility," Holt was saying. "Whatever her previous military service, I'm aware of what it is," the Admiral said. He had the same tone Dara had already catalogued. Calm. Not the calm of someone suppressing something. The calm of someone for whom the situation had already been processed and resolved internally and what remained was just the administrative work of communicating that resolution to others. I'm not here to discuss the facility's administrative structure, Ms. Holt. I'm here to understand what occurred today and to ensure the welfare of the personnel who were injured. The individuals who were injured are receiving appropriate care. They are, the Admiral said. In several cases, because of the actions of a nurse you suspended this morning. Holt's jaw tightened. Ms. Voss's suspension was issued for documented insubordination. I'd like to see that documentation. A beat. That's an internal HR matter. I'm making it my concern. He said it without heat. The footage from this ER during today's event is also my concern. I've already requested a copy. Holt said nothing. Her face had gone to a particular kind of stillness that Dara recognized as the stillness of a person recalculating. Dara turned and walked back toward the patient bays. Whatever that conversation was becoming, it didn't need her in it yet. She had more immediate things to attend to. At 11:45, Dr. Marsh came into the ER. He came with the energy of a man who had been informed about a situation and was arriving to manage it before it managed him, which was, she knew, how he approached most problems. Marsh was good at institutional management. He understood leverage and optics and the specific ways that incidents could be shaped or contained depending on how quickly they were addressed. He was not, in her assessment, a bad doctor. He was a physician who had risen far enough into administration that his skill at administration had become more developed than his skill at medicine, and who had decided, somewhere along the way, that protecting the institution was the same thing as protecting the patients inside it. He found her at the nurse's station, updating charts. Voss, he said, and the word had a particular weight to it, the weight of someone who was not sure yet whether to be conciliatory or authoritative, and had not quite decided which would serve him better. She kept her eyes on the chart. Dr. Marsh, we need to talk about what's happening here. I'm working. She moved the cursor. Unless you're suspending me again, in which case the timing is inconvenient. I'm not, he stopped. Recalibrated. I'm trying to understand the situation. Which part of it? You came back after being suspended. You practiced nursing functions without an active badge. You were present in an operating room. Dara, regardless of the outcome, today, that's a liability issue, she said. I know. You can add it to my file. She finally looked at him. Were any of them supposed to die? He blinked. What? The 9 casualties I was involved with today. Were any of them supposed to die? And I just inconveniently kept them alive in a way that creates a documentation problem for you? Because I want to understand the nature of the concern here. His face went through several things. Frustration. Something that might have been shame. Calculation. That's not what I said, he said. No, it isn't. She closed the chart. You should know that there's a Vice Admiral in your building who has already asked for the incident documentation and the ER security footage. Whatever conversation you're planning to have about my suspension and my return to this floor, I'd factor that in. She watched him process it. Who was the man in Bay 1? He said. The rod extraction. I don't know yet, but the Admiral does. The Admiral knows things, she said. That seems to be his general situation. Marsh looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he walked away, in the direction of Holt's office, which was almost certainly the right move for a man trying to get ahead of a situation he didn't fully understand. Dara turned back to her charts. She found out the name of the man in Bay 1 at 12:50 in the recovery corridor outside OR 3 from the Vice Admiral himself. He came to her this time, which reversed the dynamic from the stairwell. He stood in the corridor with his hands behind his back and told her in clear, unembellished language that the man she had helped, Captain Ryland Vance, the commanding officer of a Classis Naval Special Operations Maritime Unit, and that the event this morning had not been a routine training accident. She absorbed that without expression. How many of his people? She said. 12 were in the immediate blast zone. 9 survived the initial event. Of those 9, 7 are in this building right now. He paused. 3 of them are alive because of decisions you made in the first 40 minutes. She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 48 hours ago, she wouldn't have been able to point to her day and call it meaningful. This morning, she had been suspended and told to leave. She was tired in a way that went through the muscles and into something structural. "Is the captain going to make it?" she said. "Dr. Anand thinks so. She says the prognosis is guarded, but the surgery went as well as it could have." He paused. "She also told me you identified the rod stabilization protocol before any of the attending physicians. Anyone with blast trauma experience would have. There was nobody else in that room with blast trauma experience." She said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I've been in contact with Hargrove's Administrative Oversight Board, and with the JG office, and with someone who runs a program I think you should know about." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded document. "I'm not going to hand this to you right now, because right now isn't the right moment, and because I want to have a proper conversation before we discuss what's in it. But I want you to know it exists." She looked at the document without taking it. "What is it?" "A possibility," he said. "A significant one." He put it back in his pocket. "First, I need to watch how this afternoon resolves." She straightened from the wall. "What's happening this afternoon?" He looked at her with the evaluating expression she'd seen in the corridor. Something had shifted whatever question had been behind it before. It seemed like he was close to an answer. "Dr. Marsh has convened an emergency administrative review," he said. "Nominally about your unauthorized return to duty. Your nursing director is already in the room. So is Dr. Ferris." She felt something move through her chest. Not fear, not exactly. The particular sensation of a situation arriving that you had known was coming and had tried to stay ahead of and had not quite managed to. "When?" she said. 20 minutes ago. She was already moving. "Voss," the Admiral said behind her. She stopped but didn't turn. "The camera system in this hospital covers the entire ER floor," he said. "Every bay, every corridor, 4-hour rolling retention, but I've already had it flagged and preserved from 6:45 a.m. through current time." A pause. "Every decision you made today is on that footage. So is every decision everyone else made." She stood in the corridor for a moment, her back to him, her hands at her sides. Then she turned around. "Were you going to tell me that before or after the review?" Something that might have been a very controlled version of a smile moved across his face. "I'm telling you now." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back toward the administrative corridor, and her pace was not hurried. It was the pace of someone who had stopped running from things and was simply moving toward them. The elevator was waiting. She stepped in. As the doors closed through the narrowing gap, she could see the Vice Admiral still standing in the recovery corridor with his hands behind his back, watching her go, and behind him, being wheeled out of OR. 3 in a recovery bed, face pale and still but chest moving, with the steady rhythm of someone who had been pulled back from the edge by a series of decisions made correctly under pressure. Captain Ryland Vance was alive. The elevator doors closed, and, on the 3rd floor, in a conference room she had never been invited into, the administrative review that was supposed to end her career was already 22 minutes into proceedings, and nobody in that room yet knew that a Vice Admiral had just spent the better part of 3 hours watching everything they'd done and hadn't done, and had already made his own decisions about what it meant. The conference room on the 3rd floor was called the Whitmore Room, which was the name of a former hospital administrator who had apparently done something noteworthy enough to earn a brass plate on the door, but not noteworthy enough that anyone remembered what it was. It was a rectangular room with a long table, 9 chairs, a wall-mounted screen for presentations, and windows that looked out over the hospital's east parking structure. The blinds were half closed. The lighting was the specific fluorescent flatness of institutional spaces designed to communicate seriousness without requiring any actual architectural investment. Dara stepped through the door at 1:17 p.m. There were 5 people already seated. Sylvia Holt already seated. Sylvia Holt at the head of the table with the arranged composure of someone who had prepared for this and was managing the anxiety of the preparation. Dr. Elliot Marsh to her left, a legal pad in front of him, a pen in his hand that he was not using. Dr. Leonard Ferris, 2 seats down, arms crossed, looking at the table. A woman Dara didn't recognize, 40s. Dark blazer, a laptop open in front of her, which suggested HR or legal or both. And at the far end, half turned toward the window, a man from the hospital's patient safety board whose name remembered as Greering, whose name Dara as Greer, who had the permanent expression of someone wishing he were somewhere else. She took the empty chair on the opposite side of the table from Holt without being invited to and set her hands flat on the surface in front of her. "We weren't sure you were coming," Holt said. "I was finishing a patient assessment." She looked around the table. "Who's running this?" "I am," Marsh said. "Okay," she looked at him. "Go ahead." Marsh uncapped his pen. "This is an emergency administrative review convened under Section 12 of the Hargrove Medical Center Employee Conduct Policy. The review concerns the events of this morning, specifically your unauthorized return to this facility following a formal suspension. To this suspension, your performance of nursing duties without an active employment credential, your presence in an operating room without authorization, and a pattern of conduct that the administration believes though represents a serious and ongoing threat to the safety protocols of this institution." He delivered it in the tone of someone who had rehearsed it, which he probably had. "Is that everything?" she said. "For now. Then I want to know if this review has been recorded and whether I'm entitled to representation." She kept her voice level, not combative, procedural. "Because if this is a formal disciplinary proceeding, there are HR requirements around how it's conducted, and I'd like to make sure we're following them before anyone says anything they'll need to walk back later." The woman with the laptop HR, Dara confirmed to herself, shifted slightly in her chair. "Ms. Voss, this is a preliminary review, not a formal termination hearing. You are not required to have representation at this stage, but I can request it." A pause. "You can request it. The review can be delayed 24 hours to allow you to—" "I don't want to delay it," Dara said. "I want to proceed. I'm just establishing what this is." She looked back at Marsh. "Go ahead." Marsh studied her for a moment with the expression of someone who had acted a different kind of opponent and was adjusting. "Dr. Ferris has filed a formal statement regarding this morning's events in Trauma Bay 2 prior to the mass casualty event. Sylvia, if you want to." Holt opened her folder. "At approximately 6:40 a.m., Dr. Ferris was treating a cardiac patient in Trauma Bay 2 when you interfered with his medical management, refused a direct order, and escalated the situation to the point that it disrupted patient care. The patient's rhythm stabilized on magnesium within 4 minutes of administration," Dara said. "The nursing incident report I filed at 6:48 documents the clinical rationale. Has anyone in this room read that report?" Silence. "Has anyone pulled the patient's chart from this morning?" More silence. Ferris was still looking at the table. "The patient," she continued, "presented with a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia pattern, consistent with torsades de pointes. Amiodarone is contraindicated in torsades because it prolongs the QT interval and worsens the arrhythmia. The standard of care for that presentation is magnesium sulfate and electrolyte correction. Those are not my opinions. They're in these ACLS guidelines, which I can pull up on that laptop right now if it would be helpful." The HR woman was typing something. Ferris uncrossed and recrossed his arms. "The point," Marsh said, "is not whether your clinical instinct was. My clinical instinct was correct. The patient is alive. The documentation supports the decision." If you want to discipline me for it, you'll need to explain to a review panel why the correct clinical intervention that resulted in a positive patient outcome constitutes a violation of conduct. She looked at Holt. You've done this long enough to know that argument doesn't hold. Holt's jaw moved slightly. The issue is insubordination, Dara, not the outcome. The issue, Dara said, is that insubordination is the word you use when a nurse is right and an attending is wrong, and nobody knows how to file the paperwork for that. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm telling you what a review panel will find if this goes further. The chart, the nursing note, and the patient outcome will all say the same thing. Greer, at the far end of the table, was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't quite read. We'll move to the second matter, Marsh said, and his voice had changed slightly, still controlled, but the control was working harder. Your unauthorized return to the ER during a declared mass casualty event. Yes, you had been suspended. Your badge had been surrendered. You had no clinical authorization to 27 military. Personnel came through those doors between 9:17 and 10:40 this morning, she said. 15 of them had critical injuries. The ER had 2 attending physicians on shift, both of whom have their competencies. Both of whom were managing circumstances they had not been trained for in the volume and complexity that arrived this morning. I have been trained for exactly that. I made a decision to remain and assist. She paused. If you want to argue that I should have walked out and let the outcomes be what they were going to be, you can make that argument. I'm not sure you'll enjoy making it. Marsh set his pen down. Dara, the door opened. Not a knock, not a request. The door simply opened, and the Vice Admiral walked in, and the room shifted the way. And the room shifted when the center of gravity in them suddenly changed. He was followed by the woman in the dark suit from earlier and a second officer, who stayed near the door. Nobody at the table spoke for a moment. The Admiral looked around the room without particular urgency. I apologize for the interruption, he said, in a tone that conveyed no apology whatsoever. My name is Vice Admiral Corwin Tate, Naval Operational Command East. I have some information relevant to what I understand is being discussed in this room. Marsh found his voice first. Admiral, this is an internal administrative. I'm aware of what it is. Tate pulled out the chair at the corner of the table nearest the door and sat in it without being invited. Please continue. I'll wait until there's a natural pause. He set a mantilla folder on the table in front of him and folded his hands over it. The room was very quiet. Holt looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at his legal pad. Ferris had gone absolutely still in the way that people went still when they began to understand that the situation they were in was not the situation they had thought they were in. Dara looked at Tate. He was watching the table with the placid attention of someone who had sat in many rooms waiting for many things and had learned to treat waiting as a neutral state rather than an unpleasant one. Dr. Marsh, Holt said carefully, perhaps we should. We should finish what we started, Marsh said, with the conviction of a man who had gotten this far and was going to see it through, whether or not seeing it through was wise. He picked up his pen again. Dara, the third matter is your presence in the operating room during Captain Vance's procedure. You were not the assigned scrub nurse. You were not authorized to be in that OR. Dr. Anand requested my presence, Dara said. A pause. She verbally requested that I scrub in. If you need that confirmed, she's in the building. Dara looked at Marsh with the flatness of someone who had run out of patience for a performance that was wasting her time. Is there anything else, or are we done with the things that have straightforward answers? Marsh set the pen down again. This time he left it. Ferris cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something careful and slightly diminished, like a man who had come into a room with a position and was finding that position harder to maintain than he'd expected. I want to say he started and then stopped. Everyone waited. I want to say that the patient outcome this morning in Bay 2 was positive. I acknowledge that. He was looking at the table. The clinical discussion was another stop. heated. The room absorbed that. That's a generous characterization, Dara said, but without heat, which made it land differently than if she'd said it with any. Admiral Tate unfolded his hands and opened the manila folder. If this is a natural pause, he said, I'd like to share something. Nobody objected. Nobody had the standing to. And everyone in the room seemed to understand that. He removed a set of documents and placed them in the center of the table. This is a summary timeline of events in the Hargrove Emergency Department from 6:45 a.m. through approximately 12:30 p.m. today. It was compiled from the hospital's security camera system, which covers the ER floor comprehensively. He tapped the top sheet. I've had my staff review 12 hours of footage. The summary represents what the footage shows. Holt said, Admiral, with respect, that footage is the property of this institution. I've been in contact with your oversight board, Tate said. They've authorized my access as part of the military incident investigation into the training facility event. That authorization came through about 40 minutes ago. He looked at Holt with the expression of someone being courteous as a choice rather than a necessity. I wanted to wait until I had it before I came in here. I didn't want there to be any question about the process. Holt looked at the documents. Marsh looked at the documents. Ferris did not look at the documents, which was its own kind of answer. The footage, Tate continued, shows the sequence of events in Trauma Bay 2 this morning from the beginning of the incident with the cardiac patient through the arrival of military casualties. It shows the decisions made by each member of the clinical team during both events. He paused. I'm not going to characterize what it shows. Anyone who wants to review it can do so. I've brought a copy. He produced a small drive from his breast pocket and set it on top of the documents. What I will say is that the footage shows Nurse Voss identifying a clinical problem in Bay 2, communicating it clearly, and being correct. It shows the outcome of that intervention. And it shows in considerable detail what happened in this emergency room between 9:17 and approximately 11 a.m. The room was very still. It shows, he said, every decision that was made. And every decision that wasn't. The last sentence landed in the specific way. Plainly stated true things landed when everyone in the room already knew them and had been hoping nobody was going to say them out loud. Ferris's face, when Dara looked at him, had gone to a grayish tone that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. He was a physician who had frozen. Not completely, he had functioned. He had treated patients, but there had been a period. She had seen it herself between the first and third arrivals, when he had stood in the middle of the ER floor and done a very good impression of a man who did not know what to do next. She had not held it against him. Fear under extreme pressure was not a character flaw. It was a physiological response. But she had worked around him. She had made decisions that should have been his to make. And now there was footage of it. Marsh was looking at the drive on the table with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations. What are you asking for? He said to Tate. Right now? Tate leaned back slightly. Nothing. I'm here as a courtesy to make sure that any administrative decisions made in this room today are made with complete information. He looked at Dara, then back at Marsh. I think that's a reasonable thing to want. Holt looked at the documents, at the drive, at Marsh, at her folder, which she slowly closed. This review, she said carefully, may benefit from a brief recess. To allow time for the new information to be, I don't need a recess, Dara said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at Holt, directly, not with anger, with the clarity of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment and recognizes it when it arrives. You suspended me this morning for saving a patient's life in a way that was inconvenient, institutional hierarchy. That's what happened. You can call it insubordination in the paperwork, but that's what it was. She shifted her gaze to Marsh. And you backed it because Backing it was easier than having the conversation about why the documentation process in this makes it impossible for nursing staff to formally challenge a physician's decision in real time without losing their employment. She looked at Ferris last. And you filed a complaint because you were embarrassed and because you had the institutional standing to punish someone for making you feel that way. Ferris opened his mouth. I'm not done, she said. Not loudly. With the same flatness she'd used all morning. The flatness that came from having nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to manage. I came back into this ER during a mass casualty event because people were going to die, and I could help prevent that. I don't need you to call that heroic. I don't need you to call it anything. But I need you to understand that whatever you decide to do about my employment, that's the thing you're deciding about, not policy violations. The thing underneath the policy violations. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. Those had been the silences of people calculating. This one was the silence of people who had had something land on them and hadn't finished absorbing the weight of it. Tate was looking at her with that evaluating expression again. Something in it had resolved further. Marsh picked up his pen. Set it back down. Sylvia, he said, and his voice had lost a register of its earlier authority. I think the recess is appropriate. Holt nodded without looking at anyone. Dara stood. I'll be in the ER, she said. There are still patients. She walked out, and nobody called her back. The afternoon moved through its hours with the particular texture of days that have held too much. The ER cycled through its post-surge state, the immediate crises resolved, the sustained monitoring ongoing, the paperwork accumulating in the way paperwork always did after events that generated more action than documentation. Dara moved through it, and if anyone noticed that she was still present and still working, despite being technically suspended, nobody said anything. She did not think about the conference room. She thought about the patients, about Specialist Ortega in Bay 4, whose fragment removal had been completed upstairs and who was awake now, and asking about his unit, about the chief petty officer with the TBI who needed neuro reassessment before end of shift, about Kepner's chest tube output, which she'd flagged twice, and which the covering resident had finally addressed. These were the problems she could do something about. The other ones would resolve or they wouldn't, and her worrying wouldn't change the mechanism. At 3:40, Brigitte found her at the medication cabinet. Marsh is looking for you, Brigitte said. Where? His office. He sent someone down 10 minutes ago. A pause. Holt's not with him. It's just him and the Admiral. Dara closed the cabinet. Okay. She took the stairs again. The physical routine of them had become something close to centering over the course of the day, the specific muscular work of ascending and descending, the way it imposed a brief interval of purely physical occupation between one thing and the next. Marsh's office was on the 3rd floor, east wing, the opposite end of the corridor from the Whitmore room. He was standing when she came in, not seated, which she noted. Tate was in a chair in the corner, in the posture of someone who was present but not leading. There was no legal pad this time, no folder. The formal apparatus of the earlier review was gone. Marsh looked at her and then looked at a point just past her and said, I've been reviewing the footage. And, she said, and the footage is, he stopped. There was something happening in his face that she did not see there, often, which was the specific discomfort of a person confronting evidence that required them to revise a position they'd held confidently. It's comprehensive, I know. There are sections of it that are going to require me to have some difficult conversations with Dr. Ferris. She waited. And with myself, he added, quieter, like the addition cost him something. She didn't help him along. She had learned a long time ago that there were moments where the right move was simply to let someone arrive at the destination they were heading toward without the assistance of your commentary, because the arrival mattered more than the speed. The suspension is being lifted, he said, effective immediately. The incident report from this morning will reflect the clinical outcome and the patient safety rationale. Your record will show the suspension as rescinded without cause. She said nothing. He seemed momentarily uncertain about what word to use for what he was doing. That's the administrative resolution. I understand, she said. He finally looked at her directly. He was not a man who found this easy, and she gave him credit for doing it anyway. You were right this morning. In Bay 2. The clinical call was right. A pause. And this afternoon was, he exhaled. I handled this afternoon wrong. It was not a fulsome apology. It was not the kind of acknowledgement that made for a meaningful story. It was incomplete and slightly awkward, and arrived too late, which was how most acknowledgments actually arrived. And it was real, in a way, that the performance of the conference room had not been. She accepted it for what it was. Okay, she said. Tate, from his corner, said, Dr. Marsh, I wonder if you'd give us a few minutes. Marsh picked up his phone from the desk with the energy of a man grateful for an exit, said he'd have his assistant update the HR system before end of day, and left. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the Creston Harbor water was catching the late afternoon light in the specific silvered way of water in winter, flat and cold and somehow still. Tate reached into his breast pocket and removed the folded document. He placed it on the desk between them. I want to explain what this is, he said. She looked at it without touching it. There's a program, he said. It operates under Naval Special Warfare Command. It's called the Tactical Medical Integration Unit. Its function is to develop and refine trauma protocols for maritime special operations, the kind of medical response that doesn't look like a hospital that operates in austere environments with incomplete information and compromised equipment, and that needs to get outcomes that shouldn't be possible with the resources available. He paused. The unit has been functioning for 3 years. Its lead medical training advisor left 8 months ago to return to clinical practice. The position has been open since. She looked at the document. The position involves developing curriculum, running live simulation exercises with active special operations teams, deploying for field consultation during high-risk operations, and functioning as the primary medical authority for a unit that operates in conditions your colleagues in this building will never encounter. He leaned forward slightly. It's not a nursing position. It's not a physician position. It's a role that was designed for someone with exactly the overlap of skills you have: clinical nursing competency, at a high level, and combat medicine experience in real operational contexts. You knew, she said, before today. You knew about my service record. We've been looking for someone with your profile for 8 months, he said. Your name came up through a contact at Bethesda who worked with your old unit. I've had your file for 3 weeks. I came to Creston Harbor today for the training exercise review, but I'd planned to come by this hospital regardless. A pause. I didn't anticipate the morning going the way it did. She looked at him. You watched me work. I watched you work, he confirmed. And I watched the people around you. And I watched what happened when the institution met something it wasn't designed for. She picked up the document, unfolded it. It was 3 pages, dense with text, the kind of language that military documents used to describe things that were serious without overstating what they were. She read it at the pace of someone reading carefully, not performing reading. The position was based out of the Naval Amphibious Station, 2 hours north. Operational deployments, up to 90 days per year. A GET's pay scale she hadn't expected. A direct reporting line to the Special Operations Command Surgeon, bypassing the institutional politics that had defined her morning. She read to the end. She folded it again. I need to think about it, she said. That's fair. He stood. Take 24 hours. The offer is formal. It's been approved at the command level, but it requires your acceptance, and I'd rather you give that when you're certain than quickly, because the day has been what it has been. She nodded. He moved toward the door, and she was going to let him reach it, but something stopped her. Not sentiment. A question she actually needed the answer to. Captain Vance, she said this morning. Was it really a training accident? Tate paused at the door. His back was to her. That investigation is ongoing, he said. That's not an answer. He turned slightly, not fully. The angle of his face was enough to communicate that he was aware of the incompleteness of what he'd said and had said it deliberately. No, he said. It isn't. He left. She stood in the office for a moment, the document in her hand, the harbor light coming through the window at a late afternoon angle, and the thing he'd just not said sitting in the room, with her like a weight that had been set down carefully rather than dropped. If it wasn't a training accident, then 12 special operations personnel had been deliberately targeted at a classified facility. 7 of them were in this building right now, recovering from injuries that someone had intended them to have. Vance, in the ICU bed upstairs, was alive because a rod of structural steel had accidentally compressed, rather than severed the vessels it had come, to rest against a millimeter of difference between the outcome she'd managed and the outcome she hadn't been able to prevent. Someone had tried to kill him, and in the last 6 hours, she had become the person who knew his face, who had been in the room when his life was being saved, who had been named by a Vice Admiral in a hospital corridor in connection with an event that was apparently not what anyone had told the press it was. She folded the document into her front pocket. She was going back to the ER. She had an end-of-shift assessment to complete on 3 patients, and she was not going to process the rest of this standing in Marsh's office. She was 3 steps into the hallway when her pager went off. She looked down at it, an old model hospital pager, the kind that displayed text in a small window. The code on it was a nursing station page, Bay 7. She recognized the number. Bay 7 was where they'd put 2 of Vance's unit members, the ones stable enough for a general monitored bed rather than the ICU. She was moving before she finished reading the message, because the message said, patient unresponsive, unknown etiology, which meant one of the people who was supposed to be stable had stopped being stable. And it had happened fast enough that the nurse on duty didn't know why. She hit the stairwell door at a run. 2 floors down, Bay 7, a man who had survived a blast that should have killed him was flatling on a monitor and standing outside the bay door, back turned, walking away at the measured pace of someone trying not to walk too fast, was a figure in hospital scrubs that Dara registered in her peripheral vision for exactly 1 second before her attention went to the patient. She was in the bay in 4 strides, calling for crash cart, calling for the attending, hands already moving. It was only later, after the code, after the outcome, after the dust settled on everything that happened in those 4 minutes, that she would replay what she'd seen in that peripheral second. The scrubs, the gate, the lanyard without an ID badge clipped to it. The direction of travel, which was not toward the nursing station or toward the exit, but toward the stairwell that led to the ICU floor where Captain Ryland Vance was lying in a bed with no guard outside his door, because nobody had yet made the formal determination that he needed one. The crash cart hit the bay door frame on the way in because whoever had pulled it was moving too fast, and the impact sent the defibrillator paddles swinging on their hooks. And none of that mattered because Dara was already at the bedside with 2 fingers on the patient's carotid and finding nothing. The monitor showed a flat artifact pattern, not true asystole, not ventricular fibrillation. Something in between that her brain processed in the same second. Her hands were moving to check lead placement because the first rule when a monitor shows something that doesn't match the clinical picture was always to check the equipment before you treated the equipment's opinion. The leads were intact. The rhythm was real. "Get me the AED," she said, because the crash cart's defibrillator was older and she wanted the cleaner read. "And someone call a code. Where's the covering resident?" "Dr. Pellman's on the floor," a nurse said from behind her. Young voice, controlled but barely. "Get him in here now." She started compressions. The patient was a Navy petty officer named Garza, 31 years old, who had been stable 40 minutes ago when she'd last checked his chart blast injury to the left arm and torso, 2 fractured ribs, a laceration that had been sutured, nothing that pointed toward a cardiac event. His admitting labs had shown elevated troponin, which was consistent with blast myocardial injury, and which had been noted and flagged for trending. Blast cardiac injury could produce delayed arrhythmias. That was real. That was documented. That was the explanation that was right there, available and medically coherent. She kept that explanation in the front of her mind while the back of her mind was doing something else entirely. The AED arrived. She paused compressions to apply the pads, read the rhythm. Pulseless electrical activity, PEEA. Organized electrical activity with no mechanical output, which meant the heart was getting the signal but not responding to it. In a blast injury patient with elevated troponin, the differential was long, and several items on it were survivable with the right intervention. She called out the differential as she worked, partly to organize her own thinking, and partly to give the resident Pellman, 28 years old, 3 months into his ER rotation, currently arriving in the bay door with the expression of someone who had been running a framework to work inside. Tamponade, tension pneumo, massive PE, hypovolemia, electrolyte, check his potassium from the last draw. Last potassium was 4.1, the nurse said. Okay, not that. Epinephrine, 1 milligram IV push. Pellman moved to the cart. His hands were steady, which she noted. Whatever he was feeling, he was managing it. They worked the code for 9 minutes. She was aware of the time the way she was always aware of time during these situations, not anxiously, but precisely, because time in a cardiac arrest was not abstract. It was the specific arithmetic of cellular injury in a brain that was not getting perfusion, and every minute that passed narrowed the window of what recovery looked like on the other side. At 9 minutes and 20 seconds, the rhythm changed. A beat, then another. Irregular, narrow, complex, but present. Hold compressions. She checked the carotid. A pulse. Weak and rapid, but there. He's back, Pellman said, and his voice carried the specific quality of relief that was not yet relief, because back was not the same as stable, and stable was not the same as okay, and okay was a long way from where this patient needed to be. Get me an echo, Dara said. I want to look at his cardiac function before we move him, and I want cardiology up here in the next 10 minutes. She looked at Pellman. And I need security called to this floor, right now. Not the nursing call, actual security, and I need someone to contact Admiral Tate's staff. Pellman looked at her. What? Please, she said, which was a word she used specifically when she didn't have time to explain herself and needed someone to trust her instead of understanding her. Security and Tate's people. That's the priority. I'll explain when the patient is stable. He went. She stayed at the bedside and watched Garza breathe each rise and fall of his chest, a small confirmation that the intervention had held, at least for now, and while she watched, she thought about the lanyard without the badge, and the gate, and the direction of travel, and the 11-second window between when she'd hit the stairwell door and when she'd heard the monitor alarm from outside Bay 7. 7 seconds was enough time to walk away from a bed where something had been done to a patient. It was not enough time to have come from anywhere else on this floor. She didn't go to the ICU herself. She told Tate's aide, a lieutenant named Breslow, young and efficient, who arrived at Bay 7. 4 minutes after Pellman made the call exactly what she had seen and in what order she had seen it, and she described the figure in the scrubs with the specificity of someone who had been trained to observe and report rather than interpret and embellish. Height range, build, the lanyard color, which had been blue, the direction and pace of movement, the 11-second window. Breslow listened without interrupting, made 2 notes, and said, "Don't go to the ICU floor." "I know," she said. "Stay accessible. I'm not going anywhere." Suck, professionally. He left at something close to a controlled run, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously Tate's people were taking the description she'd just given. She turned back to Bay 7 and spent the next 30 minutes doing the thing she was best at, which was focused, methodical patient care in the aftermath of a crisis, monitoring Garza's rhythm, reviewing the echo that cardiology had run, confirming that the contusion pattern on his cardiac muscle was consistent with blast injury rather than anything iatrogenic. He was not out of danger. He was in a different category of danger than he had been 9 minutes ago, but the danger was now a known thing with a map around it, which was better. At 4:40, Brigitte appeared in the bay door. She had the expression of someone who had processed something on her way over and was still completing that processing. "They found someone," she said. Dara looked up from the chart. In the stairwell between 2 and 3, a man in scrubs, no badge, no ID, tried to get through the ICU access door, and the lock had already been changed. Tate's people changed it about 6 minutes after you gave the description. Brigitte's voice was steady, but the steadiness was working. "He's in custody. MPs. Dara set the chart down. "Who is he?" "Nobody's saying yet." But Brigitte stopped. Then he had a syringe in his right scrub pocket, uncapped. The room was very quiet for a moment. "Garza," Dara said. "Yeah." She thought about the 9-minute code, about the PEA rhythm, and the absence of any obvious cardiac trigger in a patient who had been trending in the right direction. About the 11 seconds. "Is Vance's room secured?" she said. "MP's at the door as of 20 minutes ago." "Okay." She picked the chart back up. "Okay." She did not allow herself to sit down with the full weight of what she'd just been told, because sitting down with it would not help Garza, and it would not help the 5 other patients on this floor who still needed monitoring, and it would not help anything except her own need to process, which was not the priority. She had learned that in the Army, the deferral of processing as a functional survival skill, the ability to put the thing in a room in your head and close the door and return to it later when the work was done. The room filled up over time. You had to find a way to empty it eventually, or it started to affect the quality of the work. But not now, not during. She made 2 notes in Garza's chart, flagged 3 items for the night shift nurse, and moved on to the next patient. At 6:15, the ER had reached the specific state of a late winter evening, following a major incident, not quiet, never fully quiet, but settled into a different register of activity, the acute phase replaced by the sustained. The day shift nurses were in handoff. The attending had changed over. The casualties from the morning's event were distributed through the building in various states of recovery, and the crisis that had defined the last 9 hours had resolved into its aftermath, which had its own demands, but different ones. Dara was at the nurse's station, finishing her documentation, when Tate appeared. He came through the ER doors without urgency, without the military staff he'd had with him earlier. Just himself, in uniform, carrying the manila folder again, and looking like a man who had covered considerable ground since she'd last seen him, and was now deliberately decelerating. He sat in the empty chair, beside the nurse's station, not across from her, beside her, which was a different geometry, and said, "You did well today." "I know," she said, without looking up from the chart. "That's not false modesty. I'm just not in a place right now where I need to hear it." He absorbed that. Fair. She finished the notation she was on and closed the chart. Then she looked at him, the man in the stairwell. "His name isn't something I can share yet, but you know it." "We know several things," he said carefully, including that he was in this building before the mass casualty event arrived. He came in through the visitor entrance at 8:40 a.m., which was approximately 40 minutes after your suspension was announced. She looked at him. "The timing," she said, "is interesting," he agreed. "The suspension was announced internally, through hospital channels." "Yes. So whoever placed him here knew about the suspension within the window between when it happened and when he arrived. She was working it out, as she said it, the way she would have worked out a clinical problem, not rushing to the conclusion, building toward it." which means either he was already positioned for this morning's event, or Tate said, there's a second thread. She was quiet for a moment. My suspension, she said. You're telling me my suspension may not have been incidental. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He said, the investigation that started with the training facility event has expanded significantly in the last several hours. There are aspects of it that I can't discuss with you. But there are aspects that directly involve this hospital and the decisions made in it today. And those aspects are going to become visible in ways that will affect people in this building. Holt, she said. Marsh? I can't say who specifically. Not yet. She looked at the middle distance. Through the ER doors, the corridor was lit in the evening yellow of the overhead lights, and somewhere above her, Captain Vance was in an ICU bed with military police outside the door and a surgeon monitoring his post-operative status. Alive because of a sequence of decisions made correctly in conditions that had been designed potentially to make correct decisions impossible. If someone arranged to have me removed from this floor this morning, she said, they needed to know that I'd be a problem. Yes. Which means they knew my background. Yes. Which means this isn't about the cardiac patient in Bay 2 or the insubordination complaint. Those were instruments, Tate said, the word settled. She thought about Holt's face when she'd been called to the office. The rehearsed quality of the delivery. The speed of it, the suspension issued within an hour of the incident with Ferris, faster than any HR process she'd ever seen move at this institution. And Ferris himself, who was a physician with genuine clinical anxiety about the cardiac call, but who had been oddly, specifically ready to file a formal complaint at 8 in the morning, which required a form that most physicians at this hospital didn't know existed, because most physicians at this hospital had never filed one. Someone told him to file it, she said. Tate said nothing, which was the confirmation she needed. Holt moved on it immediately because she'd been primed to. And Marsh backed it, because Marsh does what protects Marsh. She was thinking through it, the way she'd been trained to think through a clinical situation, following the chain of causation backward from the outcome to the origin. This whole morning was constructed to get me out of this building before the casualties arrived. That's the working theory, Tate said. Because someone knew Vance was going to be in the blast zone. He was quiet. Because it wasn't an accident, she said. You told me that in Marsh's office. You told me the investigation was ongoing. I did. And the man in the stairwell was there to finish what the blast didn't. He stood, not abruptly with the controlled movement of someone who had decided the conversation had reached its appropriate limit. The investigation will establish what happened. That's not your responsibility. What I need you to understand is that your position here in this hospital may be complicated in the near term by the aspects of this investigation that become public, and that the offer I made earlier still stands, and that timing may be relevant. She looked at him. You're telling me this is about to get messy. I'm telling you that the truth about today has a longer tail than most days, and that being where you are when it lands may not serve you. He picked up the Manila folder. The offer expires in 72 hours, not because I'm rushing you, but because the unit needs someone, and if you're not available, there are other candidates. There are always other candidates, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not with your particular overlap. He left. She sat with the empty chair beside her, and the humming of the nurse's station equipment, and the distant sound of the ER doing its work. And she thought about the morning, which had started with a suspension and a bag packed against a wall, and a column of smoke rising over Creston Harbor. At 7:10, Sylvia Holt was escorted from the building. Dara did not see it happen directly. She heard about it from a radiology tech named Poole, who had seen it from the window of the imaging suite and had come down to the ER specifically because this was the kind of thing that traveled fast. Through a hospital's informal communication network. Two people in civilian clothes, which meant federal, not military, not local, had gone to Holt's office at 6:50 and had been there for 20 minutes. And when they left, Holt was with them, carrying nothing. And she did not look like someone going willingly. She looked like someone who had been told in clear terms that the alternative to coming willingly was significantly worse. She was not in handcuffs. Poole was specific about that. But she was not in custody. Either there was a distinction between those two states the circumstances made clear. Dara processed this while charting the way she processed most things during a shift in parallel without stopping the primary task. At 7:40, she heard from Brigitte that Ferris had been contacted by the hospital's legal counsel and advised not to report for his scheduled shift the following morning, pending a review. Brigitte delivered this with the careful neutrality of someone who had opinions, but understood that the appropriate setting for those opinions was not the nursing station during active patient care hours. "How are you doing with all of this?" Brigitte asked. "I'm finishing my charting," Dara said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at Brigitte, who had handed her gloves this morning at 8-something, in the minutes before everything accelerated into what it became, who had not asked questions and had not made judgments, and had simply identified what needed to happen and communicated it. 20 years in this ER, the kind of institutional knowledge that lived in the body rather than the documentation. "I'm tired," Dara said. "I'll be fine tomorrow. You should eat something." "I will. There's still half a sandwich from the unit fridge. Nobody's claimed it. It's the turkey one." "I'll take the turkey one," Dara said. Brigitte nodded as if this was a significant resolution and went back to the station. At 8:20, Marsh called her. She took it in the medication room, standing with her back against the cabinet, the turkey sandwich which she had actually eaten, because Brigitte was right in her hand for the first 3 seconds of the call before she set it down. Marsh sounded different on the phone than he had in the conference room, and different again than he had in his office. He sounded like a man who had looked at a situation and understood in the last few hours that the situation was substantially larger than he'd known when he'd started managing it, and that managing it had involved decisions that now connected him to things he had not intended to be connected to. He didn't say any of that directly. What he said was, "I've been advised by legal counsel not to discuss the details of today's events, but I wanted to call you personally." "Okay," she said. "The suspension documentation has been formally rescinded. You'll receive the paperwork tomorrow morning by email. Your record will reflect no disciplinary action. You said that earlier." "I know. I wanted to confirm it was done." A pause. There was something else he was trying to get to. "Dara, when I came to the ER this morning after the mass casualty event, when I came to talk to you about your unauthorized return, I was responding to a call I received. Not from Sylvia, from someone else." She was quiet. "I don't know what that means in the context of what's being investigated," he said. "I may find out. I may not." His voice had the quality of someone assembling, carefully, the most honest version of what they were able to say. "But I want you to know that whatever that call was, whatever its actual purpose was, I made my own decisions about how to respond to it. That's on me, not the call." It was more self-awareness than she'd expected from him. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she did what she usually did with things she hadn't resolved yet, which was set them aside. "I hear you," she said. "That's all I was calling to say." He hung up. She stood in the medication room. For a moment, the phone in her hand, the half-eaten turkey sandwich on the counter. Through the small window in the door, she could see the ER floor, the movement of nurses, the lit bays, the ordinary machinery of a medical department processing the end of a shift the same way it would process the end of tomorrow's shift and the shift after that, the accumulation of days that was what a hospital mostly was. She had been part of this floor for 2 years. She had spent 2 years being exactly what this floor needed and being dismissed for it by the people above her, and she had stayed because the patients were real and the work was real, and those two things were enough for a while. She picked up the sandwich and finished it. At 9:05, she was in the locker room, pulling on her jacket, when the door opened and Pellman came in. He was still in his scrubs, end of disheveled, with the specific look of someone who had completed their first mass casualty day and was still in the early stages of understanding what that meant. He stopped when he saw her. "I wanted to say something," he said. "Okay. I've been thinking about it since the code on Garza and everything that came after." He leaned against the row of lockers across from hers, hands in his pockets. "In school they teach you about the clinical hierarchy, the decision chain, who calls what and when. And it's presented like it's this clean, logical system, and if you follow it, outcomes happen the way they're supposed to." She waited. "Today was different than that," he said. "Most days are," she said. "The clean, logical system is a model. It's useful, but models don't treat patients." He nodded slowly. "The way you work today in the ER and the code, and the thing you saw in the hallway. I don't have the framework yet for what that is." "You'll build it," she said. "Give it time and enough bad days and you'll build it." "Does it get easier?" She thought about the question honestly, because he deserved an honest answer rather than a reassuring one. "No," she said, "but you get better at knowing what to do with it." He nodded again. She could see him storing that somewhere. She closed her locker, picked up her bag, the same bag she'd set behind the reception that morning, which someone had moved to the locker room at some point during the day, which small logistics of human decency she appreciated without knowing who to thank, and walked to the door. "Voss," Pellman said. She turned. The man in the stairwell. He was looking at the floor. "If you hadn't seen him, if you hadn't been there this afternoon." "But I was," she said. She left the locker room and walked down the corridor toward the ground floor exit, the same path she'd been walking 11 hours ago when the world had interrupted. She was 4 steps from the main doors when her phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number, which by itself would have been unremarkable, except that the text contained 2 words and a room number, and the room number was the ICU room assigned to Captain Ryland Vance. The 2 words were, "He's awake." She stopped. She stood in the empty lobby for a moment, looking at the message, and then looked toward the elevator bank, and then looked at the exit doors, and then looked at the message again. She had spent 12 hours in this building. She had been suspended and reinstated and threatened and briefed and pushed through a codes and pulled someone back from wherever they'd been going. And she had 11 hours of accumulated exhaustion in her body. And outside those glass doors was her car and the harbor and the cold dark of a February night. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. On the ICU floor, 2 military police officers stood outside a closed door, and through the reinforced glass panel in the door, she could see a figure sitting partially upright in the bed tubes, and monitors still attached, face drawn, shoulders carrying the particular look of someone who had recently been very close to not being anywhere at all. His eyes were open. One of the MPs checked her badge, which had been reinstated and was back on her lanyard where it belonged, and stepped to the side. She pushed the door open. Vance looked at her. His voice, when it came, was rougher than she imagined it probably usually was, the residue of a breathing tube and a long surgery, and whatever his body had been doing in the hours since. "You're Voss," he said. "Yes, Tate told me. I figured." He looked at her for a moment. His eyes were the kind of alert that some people were even on significant post-operative pain management, the kind that had been trained into orientation rather than coming from baseline. He was assessing her the way she had assessed him this morning when he was unconscious, cataloging, building the picture. "They told me what you did," he said, "with the rod. Standard management. Tate said you told Ferris you'd let the documentation speak for itself." "I did." "Smart." He looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at her. He was deciding something. She could see the decision process in his face, the weighing that was happening behind the alertness. "Tate made you an offer." She didn't confirm or deny it. "I know about the unit," he said. "I work adjacent to it. Sometimes directly with it." He paused. "If you take the position, you'd be attached to operations like the one that went wrong this morning." "No, it went wrong," he said, "because someone inside the planning structure wanted it to. That's not speculation. That's what the last 6 hours of communications intercept has confirmed." He looked at her steadily. Same someone who tried to make sure the medical response this morning was compromised. She understood then the full shape of it, the suspension, the speed of it. Holt, who had been primed. Ferris, who had been used. The designed absence of the one person in this building who had the specific skill set to handle what was coming through those doors. "They knew Vance was going to be in the blast zone," she said quietly. "And they knew I was the variable. They knew," he said, "that if the right person was on this floor, their second plan, the one in the stairwell, would also fail." She sat down in the chair beside his bed, not because she was tired, but because her legs had decided that the appropriate response to this particular moment was to stop requiring things of them. "Who?" she said. He looked at her, not evasive. The look of someone who is deciding how much of a true answer to give, rather than whether to give one. Someone with access to the exercise timeline, the hospital staffing rosters, and the internal HR complaint process, he said. Someone who could move pieces from inside an institutional structure. She was quiet. "The man in the stairwell," she said. "He didn't act alone. No. And the person who sent him, they're still being located," Vance said. "As of 40 minutes ago. Actively." She sat in the chair in the ICU room and looked at a man who had been 12 minutes from dead, and the careful language of someone accustomed to classified information, that the thing she'd been standing in the middle of all day was not finished. The MPs were outside the door. The hospital above and below was doing what it did, its rhythms, its machinery, its sustained ordinary labor of keeping people alive. And somewhere in this building, or near it, or connected to it by a thread that investigators were currently at speeds, someone who had built this morning's catastrophe piece was watching it unravel, and knew that the nurse they'd tried to remove from the board was still on it. Vance said, "I think you should take Tate's offer." She looked at him. "Not because of the career trajectory," he said, "because the people who tried to erase you this morning. This morning, they're going to want to know who you are now. And I'd rather you were somewhere with proper force protection when they figure it out." The room was very quiet. Outside the door, one of the MPs shifted his weight. Somewhere in the building, an elevator opened and closed. Dara looked at the man in the bed and felt the specific cold of understanding arriving fully, not the edge of it, the way it had been arriving in pieces all day, but the whole shape of it, complete. She had been a variable they'd tried to eliminate. She had stayed on the board anyway, and the person who'd built the system to remove her still didn't have a name for the feeling they were going to have when they realized that the variable hadn't just survived, it had seen their face. She sat in that chair for another 4 minutes. Not because she was paralyzed, because she was thinking, and she had learned a long time ago that the 4 minutes you spent thinking before you moved were often the difference between moving correctly and moving fast in the wrong direction. Vance watched her without pushing. He had the patience of someone who understood that good decisions had their own timeline, and that rushing them was how you got bad ones. She thought about the offer, about the unit, the position, the document folded in her front pocket, that she'd been carrying through a 12-hour shift the way you carried something you hadn't decided about yet. She thought about Creston Harbor outside the window, and the 2 years she'd spent in this building, and the column of smoke she'd seen rising over the naval installation that morning. And she thought about a man in scrubs with a blue lanyard and no badge walking away from a patient he'd just tried to kill. She thought about the person who had sent him. "I'll take the offer," she said. Vance didn't say anything immediately. He looked at her with the alert, careful eyes of someone who had been doing the same calculation she had from a different angle and had arrived at the same place. "I'll tell Tate," he said. "I'll tell him myself," she said. "Tomorrow. Tonight I'm going home." She stood. At the door she paused. There was something she wanted to say, and she was trying to find the version of it that was accurate rather than the version that was satisfying, because those two things were sometimes the same and sometimes not. "For what it's worth," she said, "the rod management wasn't complicated. Anyone with your kind of exposure would have known." He looked at her. "Maybe," he said, "but I wasn't in any condition to tell anyone that." "No," she said, "you weren't." She pushed the door open and walked past the MPs and down the ICU corridor toward the elevator, and she did not look back because there was nothing behind her that required looking at anymore. She slept for 6 hours, which was not enough and was what she had. Her apartment was a 20-minute drive from Hargrove, on the 3rd floor of a building that overlooked nothing in particular, a parking lot, the back of a grocery store, a stretch of winter sky that was the same gray at 7 in the morning as it had been the day before. She had furnished it with the minimal investment of someone who had spent years in accommodations that were temporary by definition and had never fully committed to the idea that any given place was permanent. A couch, a bed, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, one of which held a bag she'd never fully unpacked from a conference she'd attended 4 months ago. The photograph from her locker was on the kitchen counter now, leaning against the backsplash. She hadn't found a place for it yet. She made coffee and stood at the window and watched the gray sky do nothing, and she thought about the day that had just finished, and she let herself feel the weight of it the way she hadn't been able to feel it while it was happening. That was the other part of the deferral. Eventually, you had to open the room. You had to sit with the things you'd put in there. The 9-minute code on Garza, the figure in the scrubs, the specific helplessness of standing in Marcia's conference room and knowing that what was being said about her was both formally wrong and institutionally immune to being formally wrong, and having to find a way through that without losing the composure she needed for the work that came after. The coffee was too hot. She drank it anyway. She thought about Pellman, who was going to be a good physician if the system didn't sand him down first. She thought about Brigitte, who had handed her gloves at 8 in the morning without asking why and without flinching, and who had 20 years of doing that, of handing things to people in the moment they needed them without making it about anything other than the task. She thought about what Vance had told her. The intercept confirmation, the inside's access, the system that had been built to remove her from the board, and the person who had built it, who was still, as of last night, being located. She finished the coffee. She was going to need to know who that was. Not for closure. She was not particularly interested in closure as a concept, because in her experience, closure was something people talked about when they didn't have anything specific to do next. She was interested because knowing who had built the morning she'd survived was relevant information for the position she was about to take. And because the work she was going to do, the unit, the operational deployments, the people she was going to train, was work that happened in the same world where people planned events, like yesterday. And knowing the shape of that world accurately was not optional. She got dressed. She drove to Hargrove. The morning was a different kind of cold from the day before drier, with a wind off the harbor that made the temperature feel more specific, more present on the skin. The parking structure was half empty at 7:15. She walked across it in the early light, with her badge on her lanyard and her bag on her shoulder, and pushed through the main entrance of Hargrove Military Medical Center as a fully credentialed employee, which was what she had been when she left the night before, and what she had technically also been at 6:15 the previous morning, and which the hours in between had complicated and resolved and complicated again. The lobby was quiet. The overnight shift was winding down. Security officer she recognized nodded at her from the desk. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Tate's aide Breslow had told her the previous evening that Tate would be in the building from 7 a.m. to conduct the formal portion of the incident debrief with the hospital's oversight board. She found him in a conference room that was not the Whitmore room, smaller, at the east end of the corridor, with actual windows that faced the harbor rather than the parking structure, and with morning light coming through them at an angle that made the room feel less institutional than rooms on this floor usually did. He was alone, reviewing documents. He looked up when she came in. "Voss," he said. "I'm taking the position," she said. He studied her. "You had 22 more hours. I don't need them." He closed the folder he was holding. "Sit down." She sat. He looked at her with the evaluating expression she'd catalogued over the past 18 hours, and whatever question had been behind it since the first moment she'd seen it in the ER corridor seemed, finally, to have been fully answered to his satisfaction, because the expression settled into something different, something that was still professional, but had less distance in it. "The man in the stairwell," he said. "His name is Gareth Pollard. He's a former Navy intelligence analyst who separated under adverse circumstances 14 months ago. His access to this hospital was facilitated through credentials that were obtained using internal HR data specifically, the staffing rosters and access systems for Hargrove's contracted support personnel. She absorbed that. Someone with institutional access provided his entry credentials." "Yes, Holt," she said. Tate was quiet for a moment. The harbor light moved on the wall behind him. "Sylvia Holt," he said carefully, "has been in federal custody since approximately 7 p.m. last evening. She is cooperating with the investigation. Her cooperation is, at this stage, what I would describe as motivated by the understanding of how serious her situation is." He paused. She was not the architect. She was a component. She had financial arrangements with a third party that made her cooperative with certain requests over a period of approximately 8 months. The suspension of your employment was one of those requests. 8 months. The same window during which Tate's unit position had been open. The same window during which someone had been watching the intersection of military operations and civilian medical infrastructure and identifying variables. "The architect," she said. "You said last night they were being located." "They were located," he said, "at 2:47 a.m. She waited. He opened the folder again and removed a single printed sheet, which he placed on the table facing her. She looked at it. It was a photograph, surveillance quality, slightly grainy, taken from above of a man she had never seen before. Late 50s, civilian clothes, standing outside what appeared to be a waterfront building, 2 miles from the Creston Harbor Naval Installation. "His name is Warren Stull," Tate said. "Retired deputy director of a Defense Logistics Coordination Office that was dissolved 3 years ago under an inspector general investigation. The dissolution didn't produce criminal charges, which he interpreted as a form of immunity. It was not. He tapped the edge of the photograph. He has been building a private intelligence and disruption operation for the last 2 years, targeting Special Operations Command infrastructure. The training facility event was his most significant operation to date. Captain Vance was the primary target. Why Vance? She said. Vance's unit had been involved in an operation 18 months ago that produced evidence relevant to Stull's former office. Evidence that was thought to have been contained. Tate's tone was factual and without drama, which was how he delivered everything, and which was its own form of emphasis. It wasn't contained. She looked at the photograph. A man who had decided that the consequence for what he'd done was too large to accept and had built an apparatus to eliminate the person who carried the evidence of it. An ordinary-looking man in civilian clothes standing outside a waterfront building, who had moved Sylvia Holt like a piece on a board, who had used a hospital's HR complaint process as a mechanism of operational disruption, who had calculated that removing one specific nurse from one specific floor on one specific morning would create a gap through which everything he needed could move. He had been wrong. She slid the photograph back across the table. "Is he in custody?" she said. "As of 3 a.m., Tate said. "Federal arrest. Multiple charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be making a public statement today." He paused. "The statement will not include your name. Your involvement in yesterday's events will be part of the classified incident report, which has a different distribution." "I'm not looking for a public statement," she said. "I know." He looked at her directly. "That's one of the reasons the position was designed for someone like you." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the harbor was doing what harbors did in winter, flat and gray and indifferent, carrying its own weather on its surface, moving in its own time. "Marsh," she said. "What happens to him?" Tate considered the question. Marsh cooperated fully with the investigation once its scope became clear. He was contacted by Stull's network through a professional intermediary, told that there were compliance concerns about a specific staff member, and asked to move quickly on a suspension. He was given information that made the request appear legitimate and institutional rather than what it was. He paused. He made bad decisions. He made them for reasons that were partly self-protective and partly because he was deceived. Whether that's sufficient mitigation is above my pay grade. The hospital's oversight board will determine his professional future. And Ferris? Ferris was not part of the network. He was genuinely angry about the Bay 2 incident and was encouraged by Holt, on Stull's instruction, to formalize that anger quickly. He was used. A beat. He also froze during a mass casualty event. That's a separate clinical performance matter. She thought about Ferris, his face during the code on the cardiac patient, and then his face during the first wave of casualties, and then his face in the conference room when the footage became part of the conversation. A physician who had been humiliated and had responded to humiliation by looking for a mechanism of power, and who had been handed one by someone who needed him to use it for a different reason entirely. There was something in that which was almost sad if she let herself sit with it. She didn't sit with it. "What do you need from me before I transition out?" she said. Tate reached into the folder and produced a second document, which was the formal acceptance paperwork for the Tactical Medical Integration Unit position. He placed it on the table with a pen. "Sign this," he said. "Report to the Naval Amphibious Station at Keswick Point in 14 days. Between now and then, complete your transition responsibilities here. Document anything that needs documenting, and say whatever goodbyes you want to say." She picked up the pen. She signed it without reading it again, because she had read it the first time and nothing had changed. She put the pen down. Tate took the document, reviewed her signature, and returned it to the folder. Then he stood and extended his hand across the table. She shook it. "Welcome to the unit," he said. "Thank you," she said, which was not a thing she said often, and which she meant specifically. She spent the morning doing the work of transition, not the emotional work, the practical work, which was what she was equipped for and what needed doing. She updated her patient documentation. She flagged 2 cases for the incoming shift-charge nurse with specific recommendations. She completed the formal incident report for the Garza Code, which required careful language about what she had observed and what conclusions could be drawn from her observations. And she wrote it with the same precision she brought to everything clinical, because the document would be used in a federal proceeding. And accuracy was not optional. At 10:15, she went to the ICU. Vance was more alert than the night before, sitting further upright, color better, the post-operative fog beginning to clear. There were 2 people in the room with him when she arrived. A woman in Navy uniform who left discreetly when Dara came in, and a younger man she recognized as the escort from the ER the previous morning, the one who had been doing a reasonable job of maintaining professional composure over significant distress. The young man looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had been told something about her and was now revising the version of events he'd been carrying. "Petty Officer Reyes," Vance said, by way of introduction. He was the one who kept your casualty count from going to 11. Reyes looked at the floor and then at the wall, both of which he seemed to find more manageable than looking at her. He pulled Garza away from the primary blast site, Vance continued. With a broken collarbone. Clavicle was cracked, Reyes said. Not broken. He makes that distinction frequently, Vance said, and there was something in his voice that was the ghost of a register he would probably recover fully in a few weeks, dry, wry. The voice of a man who communicated affection through the specific precision of his criticism. She looked at Reyes. How's the clavicle? Fine, he said. Better than Garza's situation. Garza is going to be okay, she said. He had a rocky night, but the cardiac team is pleased with where he is this morning. Something moved through Reyes's face that he did not fully manage relief, and something older underneath it that she recognized without naming, because it wasn't her place to name it. The specific weight that people carried after events in which they had done everything right and still almost lost someone, and the way that weight didn't go away when the person survived, it just changed shape into gratitude, which was heavier than it looked. Thank you. He said it the way people said it when they meant it so completely that the phrase felt almost insufficient for what it was carrying. Don't thank me, she said. The cardiac team was good. The timing was what it was. She was not going to let him make her the reason Garza was alive, because the reason Garza was alive was a combination of factors, many of them having nothing to do with her, and she had learned that, taking on the full weight of an outcome, the good ones, as much as the bad was, how people in this work broke themselves ahead of schedule. She spent 12 minutes with Vance, which was about what his current state could sustain for a working conversation. She told him she'd signed the paperwork. He told her the unit's current medical training lead would make contact in the next 48 hours to begin the formal handoff briefing. She told him she'd been through longer transitions. He said she hadn't been through this particular one, and he said it without arrogance, as information, as the honest statement of someone who wanted her walking into the unit with accurate expectations. She appreciated that. At the door, she turned back once. Stull, she said. Tate told me this morning. Vance looked at her. His face did not move the way faces moved when people heard news they were processing for the first time. He already knew. Of course, he already knew he was the primary target, and Tate's people would have told him the moment the arrest was confirmed. 2:47 a.m., he said. Yes, I was awake, he said. They told me. She thought about what it was like to be awake in a hospital bed at 2:47 in the morning, still connected to monitors, still carrying the residue of a surgery and a blast and a very close thing, and to receive the information that the person who had tried to kill you was in custody. She thought about what emotion arrived first in that moment for a person like Vance. She didn't ask. It was his. Good, she said simply. Yes, he said, it is. She found Brigitte at the nurse's station at 11:30, doing what Brigitte was usually doing, which was managing 4 simultaneous things with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped thinking of multitasking as a skill and simply experienced it as the natural texture of her day. I'm leaving, Dara said. Brigitte set down the chart she was holding. She looked at Dara for a moment, and the look had the quality of someone who had already heard something and was confirming it against the primary source. The military position. Yes. Tate's unit. You know about it? I know about things, Brigitte said. She crossed her arms. She was not someone who performed emotion, and she was not performing it now. She was simply present with it in the way she was present with everything, directly, without decoration. You're going to be good at it. I know. That wasn't false modesty either, Brigitte said. I know that too. A pause. Brigitte uncrossed her arms and picked the chart back up, which was the Brigitte version of having said what needed to be said and moving on. The turkey sandwich, Dara said. Yesterday. Thank you. Brigitte looked at her. Something in the corner of her mouth shifted into what it shifted into when she was managing something she wasn't going to name. "You were hungry," she said. It was there. That was all. Dara turned toward the elevator. She was at the nurse's station, on 2 collecting the last of her documentation, when Pellman appeared, which she hadn't expected. He was on day shift, so his being here was not surprising, but his seeking her out specifically was because Pelsman was not yet fully comfortable with seeking people out. He was still in the stage of his development where he waited for situations to come to him rather than moving toward them. He was getting over that. "I heard you're transferring out," he said. "Today's my last shift, effectively." He nodded. He had something he wanted to say and was organizing it. She gave him the time. "Yesterday," he said, "in the code, when you called the differential out loud, was that for me? Or was that how you always work?" She thought about it honestly. "Both," she said. "I always run it out loud under pressure. It slows the cognitive process down enough to catch errors. But yes, I was also aware you were in the room and that you needed a framework." He absorbed this. That's something they don't teach in residency. The awareness of who else is in the room while you're managing a crisis. "No," she said, "they don't. Did someone teach you? Or did you?" "I learned it the way most things get learned," she said. "By being in situations where not being aware of it cost something." He nodded slowly, filing it away the way she'd noticed. He filed things carefully in a system she suspected was more organized than his external presentation suggested. "Good luck," he said. He extended his hand, which was a slightly formal gesture for a 28-year-old resident, and she shook it, which was the appropriate response to a slightly formal gesture. "You'll be fine," she said. "Learn the things you can only learn by doing. Make your errors while the stakes are low enough to absorb them. Pay attention to the nurses." He almost smiled. "That last one seems specific." "It is," she said. She left the building at 12:40. Not through the lobby, through the side exit, on the first floor, the one that led directly to the staff parking area, the one she had been using for 2 years because it was faster, and because she had never been a person who took the long route when there was a direct one. She pushed through the door into the cold noon air, with her bag on her shoulder and her badge on her lanyard, and the signed paperwork in her jacket pocket, and she walked to her car across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot without stopping. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment. This was not a triumphant exit. She was not going to make it one, because triumphant exits were for people who needed the architecture of the moment to carry something that the moment itself didn't need to carry. She was leaving a job professionally. She was leaving a job that she had done well and that had treated her poorly for 2 years, and she was leaving it for something that aligned more completely with what she actually was. And both of those things were true without requiring embellishment. She was tired. She was more certain than she had been yesterday. She was going to need new scrubs in a different color, because the unit apparently had a specific requirement, and she was going to need to unpack the bag on the kitchen chair and actually find a place for the photograph from the locker, because she was done with the idea of not fully occupying whatever space she was in. She started the car. She drove. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District issued a public statement confirming the federal arrest of Warren Stull on charges including conspiracy, obstruction, and conduct related to an attack on a classified military facility. The statement was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned the training facility event and the casualties and the ongoing investigation. It did not mention Dara Voss or Hargrove Medical Center or a nurse who had been suspended and reinstated in the same morning, or what had been in a syringe in a scrub pocket, or a 9-minute code, or a steel rod, or a woman who had been placed at the board as a variable to be eliminated and had instead become the reason the whole architecture collapsed. It didn't need to. The formal reprimand filed against Dara Voss on the morning of the incident was withdrawn from her personnel record the following day. replaced with a commendation from Hargrove's Oversight Board for actions taken during the mass casualty event. Dr. Elliot Marsh received a formal censure from the hospital's governing body and was placed on administrative probation for a period of 18 months, during which his decision-making authority over personnel matters was restricted and subject to board review. He retained his position, which was the decision that the Oversight Board arrived at after reviewing the full circumstances, a decision that some people on the clinical staff thought was sufficient and some thought was not, which was how institutional decisions usually landed, imprecisely, in the complicated space between what happened and what could be proven and what could be changed. Dr. Leonard Ferris underwent a formal clinical performance review. The review found that his management of the cardiac patient in Bay 2 had been clinically incorrect, and that the outcome had been negative only by virtue of Dara's intervention. The review also found that his performance during the first 90 minutes of the mass casualty event fell below the standard expected of an attending physician in a declared emergency. He was required to complete a remediation program and was removed from trauma coverage for 6 months. He completed the program. He was a physician who had been used as a tool by people who understood his anxiety and his pride, and who had allowed himself to be used because the use had felt in the moment like power. That was not a story that ended cleanly. It continued the way most human stories continued, in the daily ordinary work of being better than you had been, which was all anyone could do with what they'd gotten wrong. Sylvia Holt was formally terminated from her position at Hargrove 3 days after her arrest. Her cooperation with the federal investigation was noted in the prosecutorial record. The full terms of whatever arrangement she reached with the U.S. Attorney's Office were not public. She had been, as Tate said, a person who had made financial decisions that opened her to leverage and who had then been leveraged. The architecture of that was not unusual. What was unusual was that the mechanism had been visible enough, in the end, that it could be documented, and the documentation could matter. Warren Stull did not make bail. The federal judge reviewing his case cited the operational sophistication of the alleged conspiracy and the continued risk to witnesses and evidence as the basis for remand. He was 58 years old. He had spent the better part of 3 decades moving through institutions that believed in their own permanence, that believed the rules that governed other people didn't fully apply to the people who administered those rules. He had operated in that belief for so long that it had stopped feeling like a belief and started feeling like the texture of reality. The arrest had not been the end of that. These things were never resolved in a single event, but it was the moment the texture changed, and that moment had been made possible by a sequence of decisions that traced back to a nurse who had refused to leave an emergency room and had kept her eyes open in a hallway. 14 days later, Dara Voss pulled into the entrance of the Naval Amphibious Station at Keswick Point at 7:50 a.m. M showed her new credentials at the gate and was directed to a building on the installation's medical training wing that she'd been briefed on, but not yet seen. It was larger than she'd expected. She stood outside it for a moment, in the cold morning air, her bag over her shoulder, looking at the structure with the evaluating eye she brought to every new environment. Functional, utilitarian, the kind of building designed for work rather than for the appearance of work, which she respected. Inside, there would be people who needed what she had. Not the performance of it, not the credential version of it, but the real working version, the thing that had been built over years in austere conditions, with incomplete information and insufficient equipment, and the weight of other people's lives as the only metric that mattered. She was going to give them that. She was going to build a curriculum around the truth that she'd been carrying since before she had the language for it, that medicine at the edge of what medicine could do was not about the system or the hierarchy or the chain of command. It was about the person who knew what to do and did it when the moment required, regardless of what their badge said or what their title was, or what the people above them thought of their decision. She was going to teach people that. She was going to teach them that the moment you stopped being afraid of being wrong and started being afraid of being slow was the moment you became useful. That the difference between the person who froze and the person who didn't was rarely intelligence or training. It was a relationship with pressure that had been built over time. In practice, in the accumulated small moments of choosing to move when moving was harder than stopping. That the quiet thing, the thing that looked like calm, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision that the fear was not the most important variable. She'd learned that in a country far from here, in conditions that she carried with her, the way you carried anything that changed the shape of your thinking. She'd carried it through 2 years of an ER that hadn't fully known what it had. She'd carried it through a morning that had been designed to eliminate it. And now she was going to give it away. That was the thing about what she had, the real thing, not the credential, not the title. It didn't diminish when you distributed it. You could not use it up by using it. You could only compound it forward into people who would carry it into situations you would never see. And, from there forward again, the way knowledge actually moved through the world, not in documents or certifications, but in the hands of people who had been changed by it. She pushed the door open. Inside, 7 people in training fatigues were seated in a semicircle of chairs, talking among themselves. They stopped when she came in. 7 faces. Young, mostly. The particular kind of that people like that, particular alert had when they'd been told something significant was coming, and they were trying to figure out if the person who walked through the door was it. She set her bag down. She looked at them. She thought about Brigitte handing her gloves in the morning without asking why. About Pellman running the differential. About Garza's chest rising when it hadn't been rising. About a harbor in February with smoke climbing the gray sky, and a choice made without ceremony in a lobby, with the bag still in her hand. She thought about the photograph on her kitchen counter. The faces blurred by bad lighting. The people who had been there when this version of her was being built in conditions she hadn't chosen and hadn't expected and hadn't, in the end, required her to be anything other than the thing she already was. "My name is Dara Voss," she said. "I was a combat medic, then a trauma nurse. Now I'm here." She looked at them one at a time, 7 faces, 7 futures, 7 people who were going to go into places she couldn't follow and do things she couldn't predict, and who needed to be able to function at the edge of what was possible when nothing else was working. We're going to start with pressure, not because it's where the interesting stuff is, but because it's where you find out who you actually are versus who you thought you were. Those are different things. Most people don't know the difference until the moment when it costs them something. A pause. Outside, the cold Keswick Point wind moved against the windows. "The goal," she said, "is that when that moment arrives, you're already decided." She reached into her bag for the first materials. She got to work.